Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Sunday Shot. It's great to be with you. As you'll see, I'm already surrounded by our participants for this morning's show. Dave, my co-host, welcome.
The media watch, everybody.
And we have Bruce Wolpe, returning friend of the Sunday Shot, back for another conversation. Thank you for joining us again, Bruce.
Thank you, Joe.
And making her debut with the Sunday Shot is someone I'm sure will be no stranger to most of our viewers, is we have Nicole Chvastek. Sorry.
It's an alphabet, Joe.
It
so
is.
You're not the first one to do that.
But I apologise.
Well, good. Good to be here.
I am joining you from the land of the mighty Gadigal, the Eora Nation, and we're back for, what was yet another big week in Australian politics, spilling onto the international stage this time. It seems that it was all about that meeting this week. But before we get into that conversation and the implications more broadly for Australia's relationships, particularly within the region and particularly with China, we'll touch briefly on some of the other big news of the week. Here in Australia, there's been a lot of toing and froing about the reforms to the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act yet again. Bernard Keating-Crikey on Friday had some great quotes from none other than Anthony Albanese when he introduced a private members bill back in September 2005, where he sought to fill the glaring gap, as he called it, in matters of national environmental significance, namely climate change. And the whole point of the private members bill was to close that gap and to introduce a climate trigger. Nicole, it's always interesting, isn't it, when you see the way politicians in particular agitated about things and were exercised about important issues when in opposition, and the way that can dramatically change when they get into government.
I think it's shocking, and it's such an abuse of trust, No wonder people have no faith in what our politicians are doing now, when we know they understand the gravity of the problem. We've been told 1,000 times by the United Nations that these sorts of projects need to stop immediately. Certainly coal-fired power stations need to be phased out immediately. And FFS, they are still giving them the go-ahead. What part of 1 million homes are going to be at risk within decades do they not understand? What part of species extinction do they not understand? What part of this world is going to become uninhabitable in many corners do they not understand? This is an existential problem. If they can't fix this problem, then they need to get up and leave and allow somebody who wants to fix the problem to do it, because clearly they know what's ahead, and they're just taking that money from the fossil fuel donors and turning their back on generations. And I think it's a disgrace.
Well, that's a very strongly worded view, Bruce. It does seem that these reforms are pretty friendless at the moment in Parliament. I mean, so many of their bills are friendless, and they characterise it consistently. And this is exactly what Richard Dennis talked about in his essay, Dead Centre, that if people on the right and people on the left are annoyed, then they're obviously doing something right, and they're that kind of middle bear in Goldilocks. The coalition are saying, well, it's unacceptable impact, the new definition of that, which would trigger, let me say that again, their exercise by the new definition for what is an unacceptable impact on the environment, and thus triggering immediate refusal. But Sarah Hanson-Young says, look, it's not protecting the forests and it's not protecting the climate without a climate trigger, so we're not supporting it either. So they don't have anywhere to go at the moment anyway.
I think that I'm not expert on the issue, so forgive me for that, please. But I agree with what Nicole's saying on the need to deal with it. But there's a common thread here on most sectors of the economy and where the country is going, and particularly when you have over 90 seats in the parliament, and that's leadership and courage of convictions to do things. And there's on something as simple as dentistry for Australians under Medicare. That's been around for 30, 40 years. Everyone knows the problem. There are real public health impact. Nothing is done. So I think it's time to step up and trust your trust your expertise, your judgment, and your desire to change the country. And so I wish they would do more. I think tax reform is a whole nother issue. It can be done. And the leaders that we admire most are those who have done it.
Those who actually.
Hawke, Whitlam, and John Howard. I will even put John Howard in that category. He stood up for conviction. The gun control we have because of John Howard. And he had to wear bulletproof vests when he went out to rallies. So I think let's move, as someone famously once said. Let's go.
Let's go.
Bruce, what do you put Albanese's reluctance to do anything impressive at all down to?
Well, I disagree. Nothing impressive at all. I believe he's a decent man with good intentions, but he is not. He's not. He's not a messianic figure. He's not a charismatic figure. He believes in. He's very businesslike, and he has a list of agenda items he wants to get, and he processes them through Parliament. He was floor manager when Julia Gillard was prime minister and got 500 of her bills through the House of Representatives. That was a major achievement. And so he knows how to do that. It's the next level up in leadership that we're talking about. And I think that the question for going forward is, well, he will be succeeded at some point. Who is best to try and capture this and really take the country forward?
I'm not disputing that he's good at operating in a very broken system. I am confused as to what he stands for, if anything at all.
Well, I think that has to be put to him and more than teased out, and let him talk to it. But it is absolutely a legitimate point because people have to make their judgments every day. Do I have trust and faith in this government?
But why do you see a vision that's so clear when you're in opposition, and then junk it as soon as you gain power?
Fantastic question, Nicole.
It's so easy to see from opposition, isn't it?
Yeah, but very specific things. I mean, that was the thing that was so interesting about the quote that Bernard had unearthed is that, you know, he spoke exactly what we all think, that an Environmental Protection Act that makes or that is silent on climate, or what the bill actually does is it requires these big projects to state how many emissions will be generated by the project. But then the minister can't do anything about that fact. They don't take it into account when deciding whether or not to give the projects the go-ahead.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that the decision-making process remains within the ministerial purview, and it is not in an independent body, which was one of the key things that the Greens wanted to see.
I thought there was a national consensus that really formed in the bushfires of 2021, and that people understood we got it. You know, as a simple syllogism: global warming, drought, fires, disaster, solve it. And that political consensus, I still believe, exists. And so yes, it's an art to do, but it has to be done. How do you tap into that so that you can really advance, do it by legislation, but take the country forward? And it's not happening. It's certainly not happening substantively enough or fast enough.
Now, the other news this week was the ongoing fragility of the ceasefire in Gaza, Dave. There were some really quite heinous violations the last weekend that did see whole families of Palestinian people killed on the ground. Israel did their dirty business and then they said, oh, but back to the ceasefire. At the moment, there is a kind of a dark quietude, shall we say, on the ground. There's a constant stream of senior US administration representatives going to Israel to try and keep shoring things up, it seems. So far, no sign at all of the temporary international stabilisation force that is supposed to be the next step, though.
Sent 200 American troops in to sort of oversee some of this stuff. I don't think any of us should memory hole the video that Trump put out of casinos built along the Gaza Riviera on top of the hundreds of thousands of dead Palestinians there. I don't think any of us should forget about that when we're trying to ascertain how real and how pure people's intentions are in this moment. I mean, there is that classic saying that Israeli ceasefires are Palestinian cease and Israeli fires. Like, this is just a slower version of what's been happening for 78 years. And it's happened because of the global outcry. They have needed to pivot. I had Chris Hedges in my lounge room just over there last week, and he's convinced that Israel has lost the narrative at this point, and that
Yeah.
this is salvaging this. And we see Larry Ellison buying TikTok. It's this mad scramble. The world sees this colony for what it is.
Mm. I mean, there's really no one apart from Turkey, who has expressed an interest in joining this stabilisation force at all. And the Israelis don't want Turkey because Turkey condemned them for their behaviour in Gaza. None of the Arabic nations, Nicole, they're all saying they're not going to do it because at the moment their mission is so unclear and they don't want to get drawn into any particular gun battle with Hamas, which is a possibility because at the moment there's no one else in there who's seeking to govern. I think Indonesia, Egypt and Azerbaijan are the countries that have been talked about, but it was always going to be the next steps, which were the hard ones. And so far it seems to be eluding anybody in advancing the peace.
Well, look, I do a podcast called Truth, Lies and Media, and we talked about the great, the Chariots of Fire music that Trump had playing behind him as he announced that he had delivered peace to the Middle East. The whole thing has been farcical. It was a huge photo opportunity for him. He got front page press around the world. Israel and a number of other countries suggested he should get the Nobel Peace Prize. This is the guy whose ICE goons are, as we speak, abducting innocent people in the United States. Apparently he qualifies for the Nobel Peace Prize, but that's a whole other issue.
Yeah.
This thing was a photo opportunity from the get-go. The next day, Hamas were on the street executing Palestinian collaborators with Israel, they claimed, and the violence returned. Israel was killing Palestinians at a lesser rate, perhaps, but still, the practice that has always been embedded there started up again. A family of 11 were wiped out as they were trying to return to Gaza City and see what was left of their home, just completely wiped out. We heard in the news media about the 2 Israeli soldiers that were killed, which is sad and terrible. But, 2 days before, a family of 11 Palestinians were wiped out. And therefore, the emphasis was again on minimising what was happening to the Palestinians and amplifying, the deaths that occur on the Israeli side. So what I see is that nothing has changed, really, that there's a smaller version of what was going on before, but the basic fundamentals of hate and violence remain firmly in place. And I can't see that there has been any credible pathway out which has been put forward, which is going to alter that anytime soon.
I mean, I don't disagree. I think the cycle continues, but at least at the moment, there's not the wholesale bombing that was taking place before, whilst the diplomatic dance begins.
Sure, but you have this hyper masculine culture of brutality and violence, and that feeds everything. And it's true of Hamas, and it's true of Netanyahu, and it's there. It never leaves, and every time there's some sort of solution put forward, even though it's a Trump fantasy, the culture of the hyper-masculine culture of violence and brutality returns, and the fire starts again.
It's not just hyper-masculine, it is that too, but it's definitely also racial supremacy, and this just always gets erased from the story. No one wants to acknowledge how just openly, violently racism Zionism is.
I think
Hamas are also a deeply violent organisation.
Yeah, they're
a national liberation army. Of course they are.
Yeah. So this is where the problem is fueled. That violence and brutality and killing are regarded as a solution.
Fair enough. And there's no real peace, as you say, and there are 2 big steps here. One, ceasefire, which is easier to get to than the other piece, which is really transforming Gaza into something for the Palestinian people and and well governed and so forth. And it's because when I think about other people who've tried to do peace in the Middle East, you think of Kissinger, you think of Martin Indyk, you think of James Baker, and they did really heavy lifting. I call what Trump does spectacle diplomacy. He goes and meets Kim Jong-un in North Korea.
Yes.
He has the summit meeting with Putin in Alaska, and he had this conference, in Sharm el-Sheikh 10 days ago. And that's what it is. It's a spectacle, but it doesn't deliver the goods.
No.
And it's an inherent flaw in him because Trump is deeply flawed in this to try and get something done. So the immediate question is, can you really get a ceasefire that gives some peace to the people of Gaza? Can that be done? And then beyond that, the only hopeful sign that I have is that Trump has made a pledge to work towards two states, and Israel can't annex the West Bank. And we've seen in the past few days efforts in the parliament, several steps in parliament to enact the thing, but the first steps taken, and the clear message from Rubio and so forth and Trump is they cannot annex the West Bank. We will see.
Yeah. So the Knesset did pass that first preliminary bill along that, and even Netanyahu had to call.
Well, that's right, because Trump will cut him off.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Netanyahu doesn't like that at all. So,
not
Why are you smiling, Dave?
Because Israel's been told not to absorb the West Bank and Gaza forever, and they just do it anyway.
But this is
supremacist fascists that need to be stopped.
This is the end of the road, and if you're going to stop it, this is it. Now, whether they can, open question. Don't know. But this is it.
For a moment.
Well, we'll keep our eyes on the Middle East. But talking of all of these separate meetings that Trump has had, this week, of course, Albanese finally got his White House moment. So before we get into that conversation, we're going to go to an interview that I recorded on Friday with Bob Carr, with his take on the meeting and what the implications are, particularly around our relationship with China. Bob Carr, thank you very much for joining us on the Sunday Shot.
Yeah, pleasure, Joe.
So the meeting has happened, finally. Malcolm Turnbull gave Albanese and the government a 10 out of 10. Bill Shorten said this morning that it was Australian diplomacy at its most professional. What's your take on the optics and the diplomacy that took place in the White House?
It was very, very successful, and we should have an expectation that our diplomacy will be as professional as what paved the way for this outcome, this very satisfactory meeting. You think about how the bottled up anger of this volatile president has come to the surface in other meetings. Obviously, an enormous amount of effort went into smoothing out potential disagreements or embarrassments, any lingering neuralgic concerns. And it was clearly Kevin Rudd at his best. I said when he was appointed, this is a great appointment, even the things that brought him criticism as Prime Minister, perhaps an over-attention to detail, wanting to burrow into every last dot and comma of any policy or consideration before the government. These things would make him a deadly effective representative for Australia in Washington, and so it's come to pass. You've got to give him credit, because he would be being blamed if the meeting had gone bad.
So the substance of the meeting, the two key issues that were discussed around the rare earth deal and, of course, AUKUS, and we'll spend most of our time discussing AUKUS, but both of them did seem to be couched as solutions that Australia could help with to mitigate the somewhat adversarial relationship that America has fostered with China. Would you agree with that assessment? And if so, how do you think that positions us in that triangle?
Well, I've said to the Chinese, you've got no right to complain about Australia going the nuclear route in submarines. You have nuclear submarines, and your military build-up, even though it can be explained in terms of a rising economic power doing what any rising power does, enhancing its military, not surprising, nonetheless explains that other countries in the region are responding. So China would be well advised not to press that. And indeed, I seem to detect that they're not giving fetishistic importance to the fact that we're going the AUKUS path. On the other thing, well, there is a trade war. I think there'll be mutual de-escalation between America and China at the end of this month. Everything Trump has said points to both sides pulling back from crude economic decoupling, measures of economic warfare. And that might give the Chinese an opportunity to be less assertive when it comes to their predominance in critical minerals. So if both sides are going to pull back from the extreme tariff measures they're threatened, and I think that's likely, some of the associated things, America's ban on the export of chips to China, China's ban on exports of critical minerals, these too might be reviewed. The urgency of what we've done, very understandably, America is our ally after all, might be somewhat less of a priority in the event of a mutual de-escalation by China and the US of their economic warfare measures.
I mean, you did get a little bit of that from Trump when he was talking towards the end of the meeting with Albanese. Interesting, though, Albanese was very keen to say this is not about, AUKUS is not about any one country, whereas Trump was very clear that this is about China, but we think things are going well with China. Is Albanese being disingenuous there, do you think? That really it is about China and everybody knows that, and he's just trying to couch things more diplomatically?
Yeah, he's couching things more diplomatically. The only case for AUKUS is that we've got submarine power that can be projected into a showdown in the Taiwan Strait. Conventional submarines, especially the French craft that Malcolm Turnbull had committed us to, would have been perfect. A lethal defence for Australia, 7 out of 8 of them in the water at any one time, rendering this continent and its waters impregnable. The only case for the AUKUS variant, the nuclear variant, is that they can go further, which means they can become an instrument in a war between China and the US. The fact is, I've got to quickly point out that every poll has shown it's not a war. It's not a war that the Australian people want to be part of. They don't want to be part of that. 59% were explicit that we don't want to go to war with China, with America. And America has got to confront that. There's no way an Australian government, I think coalition, any more than Labor, is going to give a pre-commitment that we will be with you in a showdown over China, over Taiwan or South China Sea.
I mean, it does seem to be a commitment that the US is looking for, and the Secretary of the Navy talked about we need to clarify some of the ambiguities in AUKUS, which did seem to be code for getting access to HMS Sterling in WA for further militarisation of northern Australia. Those sorts of commitments would be very difficult for an Australian government to give, but they're clearly what the American administration is looking for.
Yeah, I think that's an invitation for us forthwith to be as creative, as politely forceful with our diplomacy as we've clearly been leading up to this meeting. Full marks to Kevin Rudd for the way this has been managed on critical minerals, on AUKUS. But we now require his skills and his contacts and his careful attention to every last detail and furrow and cul-de-sac on these other fronts, to let the Americans know that no, the established Australian position is that we don't have foreign bases here. And visits by submarines, that's one thing. But it's like the marine training and the marine exercises in Northern Australia. It's in and then out, not a base. And we need to be saying very firmly, diplomatically, politely to the Americans, listen, we're a sovereign nation. We maintain, as you maintain, strategic ambiguity about the Taiwan Strait. We don't spell out what we'll do. Strategic ambiguity we want any reunification of China to be accomplished through peaceful methods only. We acknowledge the Chinese claim that Taiwan is a province, and we urge caution and restraint all round. We're not going to depart from this. And the Americans would be telling themselves, we could try this on the Australians, but we know on the bottom line, Albanese and probably a Conservative Prime Minister of Australia won't pre-commit to be with us in a war on China. I'd like to think that we'd be saying to the Americans, and further, we really do recommend you stick with diplomacy and build a working relationship with China. If you can do it on trade, as I think Americans will at the end of this month in South Korea, then you can do it on other strategic issues.
Is the Australian position then still adopting a bit of strategic ambiguity of our own towards the US, though? I mean, because, yes, we say there's rotations in Northern Australia, but they come round pretty quickly. I mean, there is a consistent presence, albeit that there are rotations. Does that nonetheless kind of increase the possibility that China will look upon us as being antagonistic?
Yeah, the driver of our policy should not be fear about upsetting China. I think we're entitled to say to the Chinese, we'll do whatever is required for the defence of this continent. But when it comes to the potential loss of Australian sovereignty, I think we should be driven to be saying to the Americans, we don't want further militarisation of Northern Australia. And let's look at the rotation of your B-52s. We don't want Australia to be regarded as an aircraft carrier for a war between you and China. That would make us a target, even conceivably a nuclear target. We rather love this battered old continent of ours, and we don't want to see it despoiled by missile strikes, conventional or nuclear, on facilities in Northern Australia that we're sharing with you. I think that's a reasonable approach, and it's a subtle one. It's drawing distinctions, it's drawing lines that the Americans should only expect a sovereign nation will do. The question for the Australian people, are you comfortable with American B-52s being based in Northern Australia with one objective, and that is to strike at China's nuclear facilities and take them out? And that's a deadly serious thing to do, given that you'd be leaving China exposed to devastating first strike by American nuclear assaults. And that's making the bases, the B-52, sorry, the stationing, the B-52 stationing in Northern Australia, very serious, a very serious stance by Australia. And we ought to be reaching into the drawer for some subtle diplomacy that tells the Americans, the number of your visits, the speed of the rotations is something that concerns us.
Because it's clear, as you say, that Australian support for the idea of becoming a de facto American base is simply not there. There's a great deal of scepticism towards that position. Do you think, though, that scepticism is shared by the likes of Richard Marles? I mean, you've said previously that AUKUS itself and the failure of the Albanese government when it was incoming in 2022 to conduct a review into both the budgetary and geopolitical implications of AUKUS was perhaps its biggest mistake as a government. Do you still think that? And do you think that Richard Marles and the like are capable of the sensitive diplomacy and, I guess, a more even approach towards the relationships between the US and China?
I'd like to put it this way. I would hope that Richard Marles, in the enormously important responsibility he has, would be acutely aware that the Australian people do not want to see, to pick up language he's used, this continent drawn into any war between China and the US. That's the position of the Australian people. The Australian people weren't consulted about the implications of these B-52s being stationed in Northern Australia. And I think they'd support my proposition that we should be very careful and make it clear to the Chinese, make it clear to the Americans that we don't want them used in a war, in a showdown, or even to threaten such action, because it would make Australian soil a target. You've got to be worried about this notion that in a nuclear exchange between two great nuclear armed powers, a third party could be a surrogate target. There's nothing new in that concept, but we've got to work against that concept being somehow entrenched. I think on the submarines, we're all playing a bit of a game here. It is the president after Trump who will make a decision when that president's Secretary of War, who could be, the way we're going, a champion rodeo rider or a sheriff from a border town in Texas.
Yes.
In a J.D. Vance administration, comes and says to the president, now, we have promised these submarines to Australia. We've fallen way behind. Our shipyards are now struggling. If we give them to Australia, we can't count on Australia delivering them to us should there be a showdown over Taiwan Strait. Why don't we promise the Australia? Why don't we deliver to the Australians something else? That would be the more frequent basing of our own Virginia-class ships with American flags in Australian ports. And we'll say this is AUKUS Mark II, AUKUS version 2, and the Australians, I'm sure, will accept this.
And well, the Australians probably wouldn't have a choice but to accept it at that point.
Wouldn't have a choice. If the American, if the Secretary of War goes into the Oval Office and says, Mr. President, this is where we stand, the Australians will accept. The Australians will accept a different version. You've got no alternative.
So why do you think it's been left to the likes of you and Paul Keating to express some of the scepticism about the way AUKUS is being couched as a sort of a bulwark against Chinese power?
Yeah, look, my instincts now, Joe, are just to let it run. Why waste more breath on AUKUS? The fact is, this is a challenge for the US president who comes after Trump. And if they're not keeping up with the Chinese on the production of submarines, and it looks pretty certain they're not going to give them to us. They're not going to, they will mount a powerful argument and say they've got an alternative, which means the basing of their subs in Australian ports.
Well, look, it's going to be fascinating to watch what happens over the next few months and then years. And as you say, up until the next presidency, who'll be making some of the core decisions about submarines. But Bob Carr, thank you very much for joining us on the Sunday Shot and for your time and for your insights. My
pleasure, Joe.
So, Bruce, it does seem in that carefully considered interview that Bob Carr just gave that he does have some serious reservations about the presence of the US military on Australian soil, the B-52s, the Marines rotation up north, and of course coming out of the meeting with Trump and Albanese, it was, as I mentioned, the Secretary of the Navy who talked about needing to clarify the ambiguities, but also made a pitch for a much stronger, if not permanent, certainly constant presence of American soldiers and their families to be posted in Perth as part of the HMS Sterling, and that would make it the second largest US military footprint outside of Darwin.
Yeah. I think Bob Carr is really focused on the central issue here. What kind of relationship are we going to have? And we're in a difficult position because we don't understand where Trump is going to land with China. We don't know yet. We know that he wants the deal of 20 centuries on trade with China and to get that. But what does he give up, or what does he trade with to get a good trading deal for the United States as Trump defines it? And my instinct is that actually he could cede Taiwan to China in terms of having an active military defensive. In other words, it's yours. You know, work it out. Hong Kong is yours. Shanghai is. So you can and that changes the whole equation here as to what happens. I do think there is a really important line to draw between having rotations, visitations, whatever, and a base, because I think Carr is right. Well, yeah, that changes where you are. So these are big questions, and they really do have to be thought out in the context of for the Australian community. According to the latest polling, Australians do not like Trump. They don't trust him. They don't like him as the leader. But they want an alliance. They want the alliance to continue because they don't want we don't want to be home alone in a dangerous world. So how you mesh that is really important, but it can be done. And I think everyone is thinking about very serious issues.
Mm. I guess it goes to the question, Nicole, of is some of the posturing around AUKUS and the significance that is being placed on that by this government, even though they had to sign up to it within 24 hours with no real briefing on it and certainly no broader and deeper consultation. Is that making us less safe when it comes to our relationship with China, or is China able to kind of rise above that in some ways and is not being particularly aggressive in its military stance, although there's obviously still skirmishes around the South China Sea?
Well, I mean, nothing pisses off China more than Australia sucking up to the United States, and a $380 billion AUKUS deal for subs, which may never be delivered to Australia. The United States can't produce enough subs for its own fleet, let alone provide any for us. So we may be paying $380 billion for a fleet of submarines that never arrives. Part of the deal is that the American president can halt the entire deal at a whim if, for operational reasons, he decides to do that. So, we may blow $380 billion that we could have spent on, climate change, universities, making us a green energy powerhouse of the universe.
Fast trains, fast trains too.
Yeah, fast trains.
I know, I'm a crazy little socialist, right? but this is, we have this dream about being aligned with the United States. We're going to give them $380 billion. We may not get anything back for that, except that we may annoy China, and become aligned so completely with the United States that we are again seen as the policeman of the Pacific. So I'm not sure that this is the greatest deal that I've ever seen in terms of Australia's security.
Dave.
Yeah, on this deal, I mean, I have perpetual cynicism, I suppose. There's a $13 billion agreement for Australian rare earth minerals, and this is from Lamestream Pod. The US Department of War is going to invest in the construction of a mine in WA, which will be owned and run by Alcoa, which is a US company. I mean, we're just being strip mined for parts for oligarchs again. Like, I can't see this as anything other than that. And then talking about your interview with Bob Carr, he said he didn't want Australia to become an aircraft carrier for the US military, and that we did have sovereign concerns about this. I think most people share that sentiment.
Yeah.
I think not just a Trump thing, a forever war thing. I think people are sick of it.
I agree, but I don't see that Richard Marles is sick of it at all. And I think I guess that's the point. And I went on in that interview to ask Bob, why does he think that it's only him and Paul Keating that seem to have the moral authority or the intellectual clarity to call out what we're seeing? I mean, these were, leaders with heft, and yet they're being ignored by the likes of Miles. I mean, Bruce, it is sort of interesting that Labor and this administration do seem to be worlds apart from the views of the Australian people. And I think Dave is right. Yes, particularly because Trump is the current occupant of the White House. But more broadly, there is not a kind of a wholesale trust of America and their foreign policy and whether it's in the best interest for us.
I see it a little bit differently. I think there are a lot of layers of thinking going on about this. And really, it was Albanese who went to China first for a week-long visit. Yeah. And it was much better for him to understand where China was before he saw Trump, as opposed to going from a Trump meeting and hugs and kisses all the way to Beijing.
Yeah.
And secondly, even though we're afraid of, oh, is China going to retaliate against us and put us back in the icebox, the freezer, 5 years ago, if we're too close with the United States? Well, that's one way to look at it. But a deeper way to look at it is, well, if we have a good working trade relationship, forget human rights and all that stuff, we just have a good trade economic relationship. Well, they want to keep that in order to keep us from going whole hog with the United States. So I think there are degrees of leverage here and so forth. But I do believe that in the government there are people they are thinking this through in order to land closer to where the obvious criticism is. I don't think it's a unitary decision. Oh, you with the U.S.? Well, that's the end of China. I think it's much, much deeper.
Well, I think China is displaying a more sort of sophisticated understanding of their place, not just in our region, but on the world stage, and demonstrating a greater confidence as they grow economically and thus militarily as well.
Yeah, and what you all are saying this morning is, well, we got to think strategically too and go through it. So I'm all for that. I'm all for the debate because it really does attune people to the consequences of what ultimately is decided.
You're
It's
right.
interesting. It's interesting. Sorry, you go.
So, Dave, and then
I
we'll
was just
come
going to
to
say,
Nicole.
Bruce is right. It's not a one or the other thing. This is
Yeah.
a complicated, nuanced world where we need to interact and relate with all of our neighbors. And, Bruce is like, if we are going to ignore the human rights thing, I mean,
Right.
we do that with everybody. We ignore it with America as well. It's like
do.
we're well accustomed to doing that stuff in Australia.
We absolutely are. And I think that's the thing about realpolitik and, the way that you deal with other nations, and is that this idea of shared values, I mean, that only exists with a handful of nations and getting smaller by the second, because the idea that we can rely on America at the moment for shared values is probably as unlikely as relying on China. Nicole?
It's interesting that the Trump administration has said, while telling its allies and NATO that they need to increase their defence spending because the world can't rely on the United States anymore, and it's an America first policy. The flip side of that is it's also said that it expects its allies to spend money on infrastructure that America, can control and use, and therefore effectively, we become clients to the United States militarily. So there's a bit of a trick going on there, where they've specifically said that we want you to increase your military spending, but we also expect you to provide infrastructure to, that we can use when we want. Now that seems to be AUKUS writ large. That is, you pay for it and it's ours and we control it. You may never see it. If you do see it, we'll contain control. There'll be flagged boats that are still ours. We'll have operational control and we'll say that they're yours, but you'll never have ownership of it. It just seems to be this giant, military cash scam that the United States is running that we've fallen for.
I thought it was really important when Albert, with the 3.5% of GDP, you got to spend this or else we don't consider you a friend anymore. I thought Albanese handled that right. It says we don't go for arbitrary numbers. You show us if there are worthy projects, we'll invest in it. And he's been able to still keep Trump on side, if you will, while making that argument. So in other words, he didn't do what NATO did, and I thought that was a good thing that he engineered.
He's got $380 billion, though, to convince them.
Well, that's a big deal, too.
Here's a little nugget from the New Deal. So we're not only being forced into state expenditures, we're being forced into deals with private American companies. We have to spend $1.8 billion on drones. Again, this is from Lamestream Pod, Osman Faruqi. $1.8 billion on drones from US weapons manufacturer Anduril, which is owned by Palmer Luckey, and people that have been following my work from when I used to write about video games. He is the billionaire that founded the Oculus Rift VR headset, sold it to Facebook, cashed out, had some really awkward, I think it was white supremacy, but it might have been misogyny. One of those moments, had to disappear for quite a little while. But yeah, now $1.8 billion of Australian tax dollars are going to this man.
And so these drones, these are to assist with the mining operations?
I think they're to assist with the further militarization of the north of Australia, as you're talking about before.
Yeah.
But under the guise of the rare earth deal. I mean,
As part of the
interestingly, on
package.
the rare earth deal, we've already got farmers pushing back and being very concerned because one of the big caches of the earth or these minerals is in Victoria on prime agrarian land. I mean, part of the rare earths is a misnomer. They're not actually that rare. They're just bloody hard to get out of the ground, as far as I understand it. And the environmental damage which is done to extract and then process these chemicals, these minerals, has been something that the West has been happy to let China do, out of sight. So even that is an interesting kind of spin on what the minerals actually are and how they can be procured. Bruce, I think one of the things about America, which you allude to in the essay that you've just written for Croaky, is it's all very well for everyone to be happy that the meeting went well and, kind of hugs across the ocean. But in the meantime, what's actually happening in the US continues to raise alarm. We've seen more extrajudicial killings, this time in the Pacific, of boats that they allege are drug running boats, but for which they've provided absolutely no evidence to support that. So there's lots of activity going on in the US which could and should be of great concern to us. And at what point, if ever, will that become a consideration for the way that Australia actually deals with
Yeah.
the nation?
Two things. America is no longer the leader of the free world because the rest of the countries in the world are not following America anymore. And Trump has irrevocably changed the architecture built after World War II on economic and trade policies and fundamentals. So the world is a different place. But the other thing is he brings authoritarian values to his governance. And he is, I have 6 words to describe him. He's in command and out of control.
Yeah.
And he where he can exercise unilateral power, he does, and he does it from Venezuela to tariffs to deployment of other military forces to putting troops in the cities and so forth. So there are just, again, several levels to this, but the key thing, I think the key thing is his values are inconsistent with an American democracy, and that is a day of reckoning that has to happen in the United States. And unfortunately, the first opportunity is a year from now, the midterm elections, because the Congress is under his control, all Republican. They support him. No one has broken with him. And the courts have not risen to say, what you're doing, Mr. President, is unconstitutional. Thou shalt not. And so
Not the Supreme Court.
the
Certainly.
Supreme Court,
Yeah.
they will take up some cases like tariffs, deportations, and some other spending of government. He impounds money and prevents it from being spent. He closes down agencies. He fires employees. So a suite of core issues are going to be decided by the Supreme Court, but the betting is they're not going to stop them. So only the voters can, and that is a year from now, and a year is a long time. And so I think we're going to be living in this very, very uncertain world from him for the next year, at least.
And until then, it does seem that Australia is just going to be kind of business as usual, unless, presumably, Nicole, if declared martial law or something, then that might be different.
I'll be quiet after it, but it presents a long-term. There's one thing of managing the relationship. Albanese has a meeting with Trump. They solve issues. They go forward. But the fundamental issue is, what if the United States is no longer a democracy? What if it's no longer the United States?
Yeah.
And why do we have an alliance? Because we share values. Well, what if we have our values? I mean, Australia has not changed. Albanese was PM under Biden. He's PM under Trump. We have not changed, but they've changed. So why do we want this relationship if, in fact, it is an autocracy and not a democracy?
Yeah.
And, it's important, I think, that we factor into our future foreign policy predictions and our relationship with the United States, how it's changing, that we're not going to be dealing with the same beast that we were dealing with in the past. And we need to have a contingency plan. We need to have a plan B because...
Yeah, and I wonder if we do.
I'm not seeing any plan B. I'm seeing love and hugs.
I saw a comment where Richard Miles said having a plan B would torpedo the plan A, so we can't do that. He said this on ABC Radio, which seemed absurd.
We need, before we get to plan B, we need a national conversation about it.
Yeah.
We need to, so that people understand from
Who's
all
going to
walks of life.
facilitate that? Our media? Like it's
Well,
this is
well,
the-
I like no, but I like Chalmers convened an economic summit. You may not like the outcomes or the participants, but it had people from across the spectrum discussing issues, and it leads to the formulation of economic policy. I think we need a similar summit of the best brains in the country. Taking myself out of it on the best brains in the country to come together and talk about all these things that you're talking about. And I think that's really, really crucial because that'll build understanding and hopefully consensus.
But the government hasn't shown any sign of wanting to
Doing that. That's
I
right.
think they have
those-
different measures of who their best brains are. I also don't think it's waiting
Well,
for
yeah.
a year to stand up against this. I think every single day from now, Americans need to stand up against this. They need to talk about this openly. Anti-fascist resistance is literally just building community and not being a dickhead. Like they're doing it every day. I see inspiring stuff. You see nuns standing up to ICE agents. I've seen a priest get shot in their head with a pepper ball. It's insane what's happening over there at the moment.
I certainly think the American people are starting to stand up and, raise their voices in protest about what is going on as they need to. And isn't there the statistic is something like you need 3.5% of the population to get out on the streets, and that becomes the tipping point where where change becomes almost inevitable. And we're certainly not at that point yet. And I think, Dave, you're right. When it comes to our media, let's not forget that, was it last year or the end of the year before, where the Sydney Morning Herald was apparently going to have a conversation about, our national security and our defence policy, and it was basically a tabloid-esque, a panic story where they had the Red Army literally kind of seeping down their headlines.
Just get a bunch of private school dipshits that know how to use Photoshop if you get people like the Sydney Morning Herald to organize that stuff.
Well, the White House has AI now, and they have things of Trump flying an airplane, dumping excrement over cities. So,
Bruce, can I ask you that? Clearly, we have some political disagreements, but clearly you are an American that cares deeply for your home.
I'm an Australian. I get two democracy sausages on Saturdays.
Well, I'm just concerned about the validity of both of those sausages right now. How did it feel as an American as a Australian American, to see that video of AI poop being dropped on American citizens?
What really bothers me is to think about everyone born since 2000. So they're 25 years old right now. So you come of age when you're 16, 18. So the only two presidents that you've really paid attention to are Biden and Trump. And you think, oh, well, a president of the United States can do that. And I think that is one of the most corrosive things that I've seen as far as the political culture is concerned. It's disgusting.
Yeah.
The normalization of depravity.
Yeah, exactly.
The left, however, needs a charismatic, messianic leader to galvanize them into action, because while I admire the priest who was praying outside an ICE tent who got shot in the head with pepper bullets, and I admire the nuns who stood up to ICE, I admire the communities who take these goons on. These are sporadic, disorganized reactions, and there needs to be some sort of tsunami response, like the tsunami of white supremacists who supported Trump. There needs to be a tsunami from the left, led by some charismatic.
Mamdani in New York City is getting huge support, but the Democratic establishment will not get behind him.
There are waves in American politics, like here on the conservative side, liberals. The last big Republican wave was Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980, big landslide. Reaganism became it. Canada has just been told no more trade negotiations with the U.S. because they ran an ad by Reagan condemning tariffs. Anyway, Reaganism was it. Democrats flattened, prostrate, just on their backs. It took 12 years to land on two moderate white guys to take the White House back, Clinton and Gore. Yeah. Now, I hope the 12 years began in 2016 when Trump first ran. But if it just began last year, we got a long road. But ultimately, it will happen. But it's going to take some time, I'm afraid, Nicole.
Do we have time? Do we have time? Trump is talking
about a real question.
Running a third term.
He can't. It's not good.
But he says he can't. But he's done a lot of things that he can't do that he's done, and I wonder he doesn't care about the Constitution.
Correct.
His goons will implement whatever he wants. I mean, the Department of Justice is now pursuing innocent people for trumped up charges in order to justify some sort of vendetta that he is pursuing. So I can't see that the normal processes of law and the boundaries that hold, tyrants like that to account are going to be there for much longer.
The first way we'll see what's exactly where that stands is unfortunately a year away. But yes, the people will vote, and we will see whether there's sufficient anti-Trump strength for it to be the beginning of the end of him.
And then, of course, whether or not, if they've taken over a lot of the state-based political infrastructure, whether or not, even if there's a clear democratic outcome that is actually ratified and registered by those Trump supporters, kind of hard right MAGA Republicans who are now holding some of those key electoral roles, which is an extraordinary thing for we Australians who, embrace our.
There's a Democrat still waiting to be sworn into the Congress.
Yep. Yes.
So the speaker's refusing. Like, how can that happen? How can you just say, "Oh no, I'm not going to swear her in"? Like, is there no
there's no shame
there to intervene?
There's no shame anymore. It's just power. That's it.
I think because at the moment, of course, there's the government shutdown and Congress isn't sitting, and he's using that as an excuse. It isn't an excuse because he swore in Republicans when the House was in recess before. But I think when the government starts back up and Congress is sitting, I think even he will find he has run out of excuses and he will have to swear her in. And she has sworn to be the final vote that is required to demand the release of the Epstein files. So who knows? We are coming to the end of another episode of the Sunday Shot. I just did want to mention the destruction of the East Wing of the White House, just because that does seem to be such an extraordinarily apt metaphor for everything that's going on in America. They said there was going to be no structural impact of that kind of Versailles-esque new ballroom that Trump has got all of the tech bros to fund, but no impact apparently can also equate to pulling down entirely the East Wing.
It kind of brings home everything, Nicole, everything that you've been talking about, the disgust that you have with what you're seeing this president do. And so I do think it's become a big political issue. And I think there are consequences from it. I think some people begin to say enough. Enough.
I hope so. I mean, that building was put up in 1901. He bulldozed the Rose Garden, which was planted by Jackie Kennedy. Yeah. The history and the gravitas and the heritage and the stories of that place are just being bulldozed so he can put in some gaudy, I don't know, resort-style ballroom with lots of outdoor umbrellas. It's just horrifying on every level.
Agreed.
I just think the context has to be also that the federal government isn't currently operating and a bunch of oligarchs are investing in a ballroom. If this isn't a let them eat cake moment, what is?
One final thing I just wanted to comment on, because we raised it last week, and that was the charges which had been brought against John Bolton. And this is to your point, Nicole, about the retribution. There is absolutely no question that those charges would not have been brought were it not for the fact that Trump is seeking retribution against Bolton. But it does seem that there is actually a lot more to them, those particular charges, than there is, for example, to Letitia James or James Comey's charges. That it does seem possible that the evidence that the Department of Justice, which is actually predates this particular administration and was initially explored under Biden, there is something to it, that he did share classified information, it seems, with his wife and daughter while he was compiling material for his book. So whilst these may be trivial, and certainly they pale into insignificance next to what Trump did when it came to holding on to classified documents, it may not be as easy for Bolton to dodge the charges as it appears it is going to be for Comey and James.
Yeah, I think there's a fair chance of conviction here. I think he left office. He left the as being national security advisor before Trump's first term finished. He saw what happened to Trump after he left with the classified documents. Now that was treated. So I think he's acted in a very stupid fashion, and I really think he's vulnerable on this.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. So, before we finish for the
Big
week,
uplift, more uplift. We need that.
um, we will go as ever to our panelists and guests to ask if they have any top tips for the week, anything that has caught your eye in the last week or you've got your eye on for the one coming up. Bruce, let's start with you.
Okay, Nicole, this is for you. In California, the latest polls on the referendum that would increase the number of Democratic seats in the California congressional delegation is well over 50% that they're going to vote in favor of it. So the giant killer that you're looking for, President Newsom, is waiting in the wings for that referendum to go, and then he becomes the instant front runner for the Democratic nomination.
I think he does. He may be an imperfect candidate in some people's eyes, but at least he is taking the fight up to Trump in a successful and very entertaining way.
Yeah, and he's got charisma, and he's prepared to do things outside the square in order to gain attention. He's funny. He's got a quirky sense of humor. So maybe he's the guy. But I just worry because Trump has this huge sort of mega machine behind him to push him. I mean, Trump doesn't make his own memes dumping sewage on people and flying in a stealth bomber. There's a huge, machinery behind him that does all of this funny stuff. And I'm not sure that Newsom has that. He's put out some funny stuff where he pretends to be Trump getting a Bible, or I don't know what it is that he's doing. But anyway, he's put out some
social media team is keeping up when it comes to the stoush of the social media stoushes, which seems to be what we're reduced to. Any top tips from you, Nicole? Something that's caught you?
I was really interested in the story that the ABC broke about why Santos is behind your soaring electricity and mortgage costs. And it says that back in January 2011, Santos's then chief executive announced the company would lead a consortium to build a massive LNG export facility on Curtis Island, just off the Queensland coast. Despite earlier internal concerns, Santos forged ahead with a plant twice the size originally planned, but there was a problem. A large portion of the gas reserves it thought would be sufficient to feed this export monster. So it signed all of these contracts promising to export gas, proved to be too difficult to tap. So it simply gouged domestic gas reserves. And as a result, the domestic supply has contracted, prices have gone through the roof, and we have inflation embedded into the economy, well, until recently. And what do they do when inflation becomes embedded into the economy? They beat up people with mortgage holders, with mortgages. So huge profits are driving inflation. Santos is driving inflation. Santos, who pays no tax, of course.
Yeah.
And whenever we've got a problem with inflation, we belt up some poor bugger who's got a $600,000 mortgage so that he can't feed his kids. I think the system is inherently broken, and I would encourage people to read this article. It's called Why Santos is Behind Your Soaring Electricity and Mortgage Costs.
Yeah, not renewables. Spoiler alert. Dave, any top tips from you?
Yeah, I just want to recommend a book that I am rereading at the moment because I'm trying to understand the mess we are in perpetually. Yanis Varoufakis, Techno-Feudalism, What Killed Capitalism. I just think in terms of big picture, macroeconomic stuff, like very clear-eyed and sharp, recommended.
Yeah, we love Yanis Varoufakis. He came to one of my Writers' Weeks when I was the director of Adelaide Writers' Week, and the queues for his book signings were, I think, twice as long as the next longest line.
We got to get him in my lounge room next to the rabbit poop.
Yeah, like the good burgers of Adelaide loved Yanis. I don't know how many of them dove into his books after they'd got it signed and had their moment of communion with him, but I hope many of them did. Would have revolution in the eastern suburbs of Adelaide. Thank you all very much for joining us again for another episode of The Sunday Shot. It's been great to have you as ever. Please do think about subscribing, do think about liking our posts, do think about donating some money to us so that we can stay on air and we can be the alternative media source that we all know we so deeply need. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again. A special thanks, of course, to Nicole and Bruce and to Bob for making some time available on Friday. Thank you all. We look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.